I am delighted to be here with Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. He's the director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University. He's also rabbi at Congregation Shera'it Israel in New York, which is the oldest congregation, right, in our country.
Exactly.
Just delighted to be here with you, and we got so much to talk about. And we've been talking before the filming, and gosh, we have so many odd things in common from the Coen brothers, whom I reverence. You know them very well, their films. And the Simpsons we have in common.
One of my favorites.
And we were able to remember Krusty the Clown's father,
Yes.
he was a rabbi, and he was voiced by the great Jackie Mason, one of my favorite comedians.
Not to be confused with Krusty the Clown's bar mitzvah, where Mr. T comes and says, I pity the shul. So,
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I was sharing that line I love is when the rabbi is presiding at a wedding between a Jew and a Congregationalist, and he goes, "A Jew and a Congregationalist, is that even a thing?"
The one I cite from Rabbi Kostovsky, from related to Rabbi Kostovsky all the time, is where they go to visit Reverend Lovejoy, the minister,
Right.
and they ask, we're trying to get in touch with Rabbi Kostovsky. Do you know him? And he goes, absolutely. Let me just check my non-Christian Rolodex.
The Reverend Lovejoy is a great
Yes.
he's a great parody of all inadequate forms of Christianity. Well, I mean, we could talk about that all day, which I would love to do. You and I met literally at the White House. I had read you for years in places like First Things, but I never met you until we were both appointed to the President's Commission on Religious Liberty. And so at the opening ceremony in the Rose Garden, we met for the first time. And we've had a session of that commission together. But right away I said, hey, would you be willing to come all the way to Rochester, Minnesota?
Thank you. I was so excited to receive the invitation.
And I'm delighted you're here. We also, of course, have Chicago in common. Yes. I'm a Chicagoan, raised in the suburbs. You were born in Chicago.
Northern Chicago, West Rogers Park.
Which is why we're both Cub fans. My parents were Northsiders.
It's great to hear. I have a miracle story actually with the Cubs, which is that.
Namely?
Well, it was soon after they won the World Series, which is of course a miracle in its own right. But my whole family, we have 6 kids, my wife and I. We were given 8 seats in Wrigley Field, which is very hard to get.
Yeah.
And so we booked flights. Early that morning, our flight is canceled. So I say to my brother, our flight was canceled. He said, why don't you drive? And I sarcastically texted back, thanks, I'd prefer a suggestion that's helpful. And then 2 hours later, I said to my wife, why don't we drive?
You drove.
And we drove straight. And
what, about 12 hours?
It's down I-80, you know the I-80, of course.
Yeah.
We pull in, get in like the second inning. There's a great kosher hot dog stand in Wrigley Field. I walk in, I say, my kids all have seats. I say, I'd like 16 hot dogs and 8 hot pretzels. We drive on that. He looks at me and says, welcome home, Rabbi Meir.
Pretty good.
And that was the David Bodie walk-off grand slam. One of the greatest games in the history of baseball. One of the few, maybe the only game where team was down 3-0, 9th inning, 2 outs, 2 strikes, walk-off grand slam. One of the greatest games in the history of sports.
Not bad.
All obviously as a reward for us making the effort to come.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'd read the Divine Providence.
It's hard not to see.
My memory that year was, I rooted for the Cubs from the time I was a little kid, so like about 50 years. And then I was transferred to Los Angeles as an auxiliary bishop. And that's the year they won the World Series. So I had to watch it on TV in LA. But anyway, so we've got Cubs in common, Chicago, Coen brothers, The Simpsons, all kinds of stuff. And now we have religious liberty in common.
Yes.
We're both advocates of it. Tell me, first of all, from your particularly Jewish perspective, why religious liberty? I mean, why does it make sense from your kind of intellectual standpoint?
Well, we have to see this. As you kindly mentioned, my congregation is the oldest in America. As I say, we don't like to talk about that except pretty much every day. It goes back to pre-America, pre-New York, really, to 23 Jews arriving in 1654 in New Amsterdam, in Manhattan. But built into our congregation story is the extraordinary embrace that Jews received in America, unlike anywhere else on earth in its diaspora history, and where true equality was found. The words that Washington wrote to the Jews of Newport were actually words. He was echoing words that he had received in a letter from a Jew in Newport, that this is a government that gives bigotry no sanction, persecution no assistance.
Give me a little context there, because I really learned that from you. So I'm a pretty ardent student of American history, and in all my schooling, never once heard of George Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation.
So it's actually part of a larger remarkable story, because Washington gets sworn in New York in 1789.
Yeah.
And the different minority religious communities write to Washington because they're worried about their future. in this new nation. Catholics,
including Catholics,
the wonderful correspondence that Washington has actually with the Catholics. So all the Catholics get together and send Washington a letter. All the Baptists get together and send Washington a letter. The Quakers get together and send Washington a letter. The Jews in America could not really agree who would send Washington the letter, so they sent him 3 letters. There's like 1,000 Jews in America. And Washington is a nice guy. He's probably wondering, why do these people keep sending me letters?
Yeah.
So he writes back to each one. And the 2 that are really incredible is the first one is to Savannah. And that is about, Washington writes, in conclusion to the letter, he writes that it describes how the miracles that God did for his people at the Exodus are paralleled by miracles that America has seen in the Revolution. And so you get a sense from there how so many of the founders saw parallels between their own story and the story of biblical Israel.
Yeah.
And then in the letter to Newport, he writes about how this is a government that gives bigotry no sanction, persecution no assistance. And Washington, that was the second letter that he wrote, and he's in each one he's responding to a letter that he receives from the Jewish community. And then he concludes with words that have resonance today, which is building on his favorite Bible verse, which is in Micah. He says that may the children of the stock of Abraham find blessing in this land, and they shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah, and that was his favorite Bible verse, and he used it all the time. But Jews had never been welcomed in this way, where founders of a country say to them, "You are equal." Washington writes also in the letter to Newport, "It is no longer toleration that is spoken of. This is not about religious toleration.
Yeah.
This is equality.
Like just putting up with somebody.
You are just as American as us."
Right.
And so it's part of our experience here.
Do you see it as the fruit of those 2 influences on the founding? So we talk about the 18th century Enlightenment, right. and indeed you do have these great principles that come out of the Enlightenment, but also the biblical strain, and I think that gets under stress. When people say, well, the founding, that's a bunch of deists from the 18th century, but there's a very strong religious biblical strain coming up clearly through the Puritans and through that 17th century, founding, if you want. But it's all through, look, even Jefferson, even Franklin are probably the least religious of the founding. But even in those figures, you've got a religious influence. But in the other ones, much more clearly.
So even Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams were made into a commission on July 4th, 1776, after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, to design a seal for this nascent nation. And their proposal, this comes from Franklin, was Israel and Pharaoh, Moses and Pharaoh at the splitting of the sea, with the motto, rebellion to tyrants, obedience to God.
Is obedience to God.
Now, of course, Franklin, as you note, and Jefferson were probably the least devout of the founders.
Yeah.
They were proposing this in part because they knew how important this symbol was and this story was to their fellow Americans. But there's no question that there is that other strain. I always say, if you look at the image that embodies the event that we're going to be celebrating on America's 250th anniversary, which is Trumbull's painting of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
So it seems like the most important figure in the painting is Jefferson. Jefferson is a resplendent red vest. And he's holding the document.
Mm-hmm.
But as the historian David McCullough has pointed out, if you actually drew an X across the painting, you'll see that at the dead center of the painting is John Adams. Yeah. John Adams, who seems to be stepping on Thomas Jefferson's foot, which you could see. But Adams, descendant of Puritans, believed in providence and wrote to Adrian Vanderkamp something like, I believe that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. Even if I were an atheist, I would believe that chance had chosen the Jews to propagate the idea of an all-knowing creator of the universe, which I believe to be the foundation of all morality and consequently all civilization.
That seems to be a real consensus.
That's a real thread.
At that time. I mean, Tocqueville noticed that.
Yes.
And is that what we're in danger of losing? That's what worries me a lot about this aggressive secularism, the relativism. I call it the culture of self-invention. You just invent your own values. Right. It's your freedom that matters above all. That when you bracket religion, morality is in very serious danger.
That's right.
If morality is in danger, then our democracy really is in danger because it's founded on it.
Absolutely. That's why In contrast to Jefferson, Adams was so horrified by the French Revolution
Right. Yeah.
and all that was going on there. And religious liberty is endangered by two phenomena which go hand in hand. One is exactly what you described, what others have called the divine republic, the republic of the self,
Yeah,
right?
right.
The famous
Right.
Sheilaism. Was that Robert Bella or
Robert Bella? Yeah.
that there was a woman in an interview who defined her religion as her name was
My
Sheila.
little religion.
She defined it as Sheilaism. I think it was a rabbi who joked that the story of Sheilaism would have been a lot more confusing if her name had been Judy. So,
Yeah.
But Judaism, of course, is the opposite of Sheilaism because it actually says it's not about just you, right? You're part of something much larger.
And what's the line from the Big Lebowski that sums that up?
Oh, it's where he says to Walt, where the dude says to Walter, he says, Walter, you're living, I'm going to clean it up if it's okay.
Yeah, right.
But he says, Walter, you're living in the past. He says 4,000 years of glorious tradition from Moses to Sandy Koufax. You're darn right I'm living in the past.
Right. I'm not making up my own religion.
Exactly.
Here. Right.
And so you have that. And then, of course, there's the other element, which is a redefining of religion so that religion pertains first and foremost and only in this understanding to what takes place in a house of worship.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's called freedom of worship instead of free exercise.
Right.
And that, of course, is the other great danger to true freedom of religion in America, which is free exercise, which means that when Catholics come together and start a university or a hospital, they are acting in a religious capacity there as well.
Absolutely. And we see that all the time is that privatization. So it's fine if you want to whisper among yourselves your little private convictions like a hobby. But when I was in California, I saw this. And then we saw it most recently in Washington State, this law that would be compelling Catholic priests to break the seal of confession.
Right.
But that they want us out of public life. They want us out of healthcare. They want us out of education. They want us out of the public forum. And we can't abide that.
Right.
You know, so that's from a Catholic perspective, but I think just more broadly from a Jewish perspective too.
Absolutely.
And indeed, it is referenced in the First Amendment. The people, they don't pay attention to that second part of the free exercise of religion means out in the public square.
Exactly. And what's striking about the early Jewish experience in America is that they were welcomed. It wasn't like in France, where they achieved emancipation, but the notion was we're going to have a secular public square, which impacts the way France operates public square
to this
today.
day.
America, think about it this way. In 1788 in Philadelphia, there was a parade to celebrate the state's ratification of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration.
The doctor
of the Declaration of the Constitution,
Adam
one of them.
Too, right? Yeah.
Who he recorded that first what struck him was he saw that there was all of the Christian ministers and the rabbi of the Jews walking arm in arm. In other words, they were part of the parade. Faith was part of the parade in all its diversity. And then, to get to the most important part for Jews, which is food, there was a party afterwards out in the street in Philadelphia, and a special kosher table. There's 1788. You couldn't imagine that happening in England or in Europe in 1888.
Yeah.
And so faith in all its diversity was part of American public life from the beginning. And that's very much at the heart of the Jewish experience.
And there's some dangers today, aren't there? There's dangers to this religious liberty that's very ancient in our tradition. Yeah. And that's why this commission, I mean, that's why I was happy to join it. Yeah. I think it's for everybody, I mean, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, all of us, because there's an aggressive secularism that's on the march, and it is a threat to us. Yeah. Hey, let's talk a bit about Judaism. Before we sat down here formally, I share with you that when I was a kid, like 16, 17, I read Chaim Potak's novels.
Right.
Now I'm this Catholic kid, from Chicago, and I was kind of a bookish teenager, and I was interested in religious things. So I opened up this book, and it's this window into this marvelous sort of subculture, of Jewish life. And I would have first come across terms like, Talmud and Mishnah and the Yeshiva and all that reading, Chaim Potak. But I was sharing with you that the plot of the first one, The Chosen, is about the son of the rabbi, and the rabbi is this hyper, intense and brilliant.
Hasidic rabbi.
Hasidic rabbi, yeah. And the son is like his dad. He's brilliant and knows the whole...
Photographic memory.
Right, religious tradition. I can cite the Talmud and all this. But then the tension is, but he also wants to read, Freud. And can he break out of the limits of this kind of ghetto he's in? And so I read it as a kid, and I, of course, loved the introduction to that whole world. But I was telling you, I read it many years later. Just a few years ago, I found it on my shelf and I reread it. And I kept saying, no, Danny's his name. Danny, forget about Freud. We all went down and stayed with the Talmud.
Exactly.
But tell me a bit I'm curious about your own formation. So you're in Chicago, you're Skokie, and you're going to...
I grew up in West Rogers Park in Chicago,
Yeah.
and my family had a yeshiva there.
Let's say when you're grade school age, what were you studying?
So in
terms of religion?
I went to a Hasidic elementary school.
Okay.
So I actually learned, first half was Bible and Talmud. First half of the day would be Bible and Talmud. And we in that school actually studied that in Yiddish, meaning we read the original Hebrew and Aramaic with translation in Yiddish. So we spoke in Yiddish.
Yeah, wow.
And then we did academic studies, which were in English.
Yeah.
And then I went to my family had a school in Chicago, so I went to high school there. And
continued the
same exact schedule. So
Torah study and Talmud
Torah study, heavily Talmud-centric. So what that means is that you would study Talmud from, let's say, 9 to 3. And then you would have the full range of high school, algebra, biology, everything was in high school. And that would go from 3 to 6:30.
It's a long day.
And then it wouldn't end then. Then you'd have dinner. And then you'd have more Talmud study for around an hour. And that would be done in what's called the Aramaic word is chavruta, or companion style, where we sit over the books and study them together, really argue about them together.
Yeah, tell me about that. Yeah. So you have the Talmud, you each have a copy of it, and you're reading it together.
Exactly right.
And then you're arguing, you're saying, this confuses me here.
Exactly.
What do you think this means?
It's exactly what it is. You're reading a text that describes the discussions of rabbis from 1,500 years ago.
Yeah.
And to study the page is to see Jewish history itself, because that would have been written in 500s, 600s. Mm-hmm. And then along the sides will be commentary in Hebrew by medieval rabbis who are arguing with each other. And then we'll study this, and then we'll argue with each other. So we all become part of what my great uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, the great Talmudist and philosopher, called the symposium of generations. Mm. In other words, as he described that these people are alive.
Yeah.
You feel like you're talking. Maimonides, somebody once came to my great uncle and said, do you have any thoughts on the occasion of the 800th anniversary of the passing of Maimonides? And he responded, this is the first time somebody's telling me that Maimonides is dead. Because for us, these are living figures.
The democracy of the dead, right, as Chesterton says.
It is, except it's not really a democracy. It's more of a, it's like the line I always quote from, do you know the movie Chariots of Fire?
Yeah, sure.
So Eric Little's father is a missionary.
Yeah.
And he's talking to Eric Little's friend, and he says, "It's okay if I do a Scottish accent on the..."
Sure.
He goes, "Sandy, the kingdom of God is not a democracy. There's one right, one wrong, one absolute ruler." So he goes, "A dictator, you mean?" He says, "Aye, but a benign, loving dictator."
A very nice dictator.
Right, yeah. So it is not precisely a democracy, right? The Talmud for us is an authoritative tradition of reading the Bible.
Right.
So it's not the democracy of the dead, it's the authority of the dead, but of course there's constant debate.
But they have a voice. I mean, I think it's Justice's point that you allow them to have a voice. They continue to speak,
Exactly.
But I find fascinating, you have that, like the Talmudic thing, and you also have, go back to the beginnings of philosophy with Plato. It's in a dialogic form. It's not in simply a master laying down an idea. It's in a conversation.
Exactly right.
And then what I was trained in, was the medieval scholastic method, which is a literary account, really, of those disputed questions. When the master would come in and there'd be a lively public debate, a back and forth, and then he would resolve the matter as best he could and then return to the objections. And so the conversational model is kind of built in, both, you might say, Athens and Jerusalem.
That's right. Exactly right. It's interesting that Rabbi Soloveichik called it the symposium of generations.
Yeah.
Of course, symposium is a Greek term. The big difference, of course, is that symposium was something in which the elite would participate, right? So if you read Plato's Symposium, Socrates, Alcibiades, like this, the elite of who's not invited to this? First of all, children are not invited, right? And they're just sitting and all, drinking and discussing philosophical subjects. Whereas Judaism has always had an enormous emphasis on the egalitarian spread of knowledge. Everyone is supposed to teaching Torah to the next generation. It's one of the central commandments. There actually isn't an explicit commandment in the Mosaic law to study the Bible. It says in the beginning of Joshua, you shall engage in it day and night. But in the Bible, the source is, you shall teach this to your children. So all forms of learning is actually teaching. We teach our children and we teach ourselves.
What is the Hebrew there, in the Shema?
That's in the Shema.
6. Drill it into your children,
right.
we say.
Vishinantam is the Hebrew.
And what does that mean?
It probably means repeat.
Repeat.
In other words, constantly.
Yeah.
The Hebrew actually it's the same thing as the word, it's linked to the word shana, which means year. And in an interesting way, the infinitive lishanot, to learn, can also mean to change. And so you see, in all learning, there is repetition, but there is also change, because there's always new insight. We, in the parlance of our times, we traditional Jews tend to call it learning, and you have to note how strange that is, right? Imagine if, you take a brilliant jurist. Imagine Antonin Scalia takes down his contracts textbook from Harvard Law School. Would he say, and he starts reviewing it, would he say, I'm learning law? No. He would say, I learned law 60 years ago. If a great rabbi takes down a Talmud that he's seen and starts studying a page that he's seen 300 times, and you ask him, what are you doing? He would say, I am learning. Because we believe that the Torah is a path into the infinite mind of the Almighty, which means that there's always new things to learn. So every act of study has learning.
How do you handle, so let's say the two of you, young high school kids, are reading the Talmud together and they're arguing, and it's unresolved. Whom do you go to then? Do you go to your master and he says, well, let me bring in a text from...
There will be people in the study hall. So if you want to see the heart of traditional Judaism, you have to go to a study hall, what we call a Beit Midrash. Now, you have to imagine this as, it sounds like a vast library, except everyone's yelling at each other, right? It's like the joke about, there's a joke in Yeshiva University, my school, that they had a rowing team, a crew team, and they kept losing. They couldn't figure it out, so they spied on Harvard. And they come back and said, I figured out what we're doing wrong. He says, on the Harvard crew team, they have 8 people rowing and only 1 person yelling.
Everyone yells.
So you walk in. I took a non-Jewish intellectual in America into the study hall, and he asked me, how do they concentrate?
Because it's too much. It's like the stock exchange or something.
It is like that, except it's dialogical. But I would recommend to your audience, if they Google the phrase Yeshiva lessons, Archbishop Chaput, the former Archbishop of Philadelphia, describes visiting Yeshiva University study hall with fellow bishops and cardinals. And the way he described it is he says that, he has this beautiful phrase, and he said this in a homily in his cathedral. He said that when a man and woman are in love, there's a spark between them. And he says, Scripture is a romance. And when I walked in, I saw that spark. So the yelling actually comes from excitement. You are excited to discover something new.
I would argue when you read the seemingly arid text of Aquinas, what you're seeing is a literary account of that kind of shouting match that was going on at the medieval universities.
Right.
When people would come in like for a quadlibetal question, so-called, where you could ask whatever you wanted.
Right.
So some smart aleck kid probably would come in and raise some question. Right. And then there'd be someone shouting an answer, and then Aquinas, and no, this is how you resolve it. And it looks pretty staid on the page, but it's like that, isn't it? It's
absolutely, except that, and I love Aquinas, and I love studying Aquinas. Aquinas is, everything is perfectly ordered, right? And many medieval Jewish texts are like that too. And through Maimonides, actually Jewish law, a trend starts of actually developing codes of Jewish law. Everything is perfectly ordered, right? Sed contra, right? And then I'll respond to every question one after the other. The Talmud is almost like an endless conversation. And it will bring up a tangent of a totally different legal subject, or it will bring up a story. And then they'll just launch straight from what we call in Hebrew halakha, law, to agadah, one of the tales of the Talmud. And so you'll be taken, whereas you'll never get in the middle of Aquinas' discussion of, I don't know, just war or something. He'll say, hey, and let me tell you an interesting story that happened to me while I was walking to the cathedral. You won't find that. Right? And it could be a humorous story, it could be a frightening story. And so the Talmud is almost stream of consciousness,
Yeah.
except that we're talking about the collective consciousness of
Yeah.
centuries of rabbis.
Let me ask you about this. I have to be curious for the longest time. So I'm going through school, let's say in the 80s, I'm in the seminary in the 80s, the high water mark of what we call the historical critical method of the Bible. Right? So when I was learning the Bible, the purpose was to uncover as full as we could through literary criticism, redaction criticism, form criticism, to uncover the intention of the human author. So we read in Isaiah, what was in the mind of whoever wrote this text, and what was the community he was addressing, and what were the concerns of the time? And that was sort of the focus of the study. We looked, for example, at like Wellhausen and the documentary hypothesis. So, here's the Torah, well, it's made up of the Elohist source, and there's a priestly source, and the Yahweh source, and there was an editor or redactor at some point that stitched them together, and, what was his purpose as he did it? And there was a great interest in, did it really happen? Distinguishing between, okay, did it really happen? And then what was the editor's intentionality? What was the community he was addressing? You know what I mean? The whole historical critical method. Now, people like me and many others kind of have moved beyond that, because I think we saw how limited that method was. And we started adopting more patristic methods and allegorical and canonical method and all of this stuff. I'm just curious, talking to you now as a very learned Jewish rabbi and having gone through that training, is that at all like what you were doing with studying the Bible? Or what were you doing when you were studying the Bible?
So in a certain sense, it's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
Because, of course, one of the foundations of traditional Jewish faith is that the 5 books of Moses, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, were dictated by the divine to Moses.
So you would just say Mosaic authorship, period. Moses wrote the Torah.
Absolutely. But that
would you use the word like dictated by, like he just took in?
Yes, dictated is exactly what we would use that word, not in description of the prophets.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, one of the foundations of the Torah is that Moses is different from all other prophets. That's what God says to Miriam and Aaron.
Yeah, right.
Right? And that's what I always say sometimes I begin a philosophy class on the nature of humility.
Yeah.
Right? And I'll say, well, can a humble person know that he's humble? And somebody will say no, and I'll say, okay, well, it says in Numbers that Moses was the most humble person on earth. Who wrote that?
Yeah.
Moses did.
That's right.
Right? Moses knew that he was humble.
I say in all humility.
Right? But Moses did know, right, that he was humble, right? Yeah. And so for us, learning begins when it comes to the Mosaic law. But it's not just law, of course. It's the text, the Mosaic text is divinely dictated. And the Talmud is an excursus that is founded on that assumption. In other words, that we believe that there is a traditional way of studying the Torah and of deducing things from it. And actually, to go back, let me just give your audience an example of what I mean. So there's an essay, it's not a book, by my great uncle, which I think is actually the greatest work of religious thought of the 20th century, because it speaks more profoundly to our time now than even when he wrote it. It's called The Lonely Man of Faith. Okay, and it begins with a seeming contradiction that so-called Bible critics, right, note, which is that when you study Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right, there are two different, seemingly, there are two different descriptions. Accounts. In the first one, man and woman are created together, and they're created in the image of God.
Yeah. In
the second, Genesis 2, man is created first. Doesn't say he's created in the image of God. He's created from the dust of the earth.
Right.
In Hebrew, Adam means Adama, dirt, dust. Yeah. Okay, or earth. And he has to give up part of himself to create his mate. In Genesis 1, the Hebrew word that's used for God is denoting him as the creator God, Elohim, right? Whereas the ineffable name the traditional Jews don't pronounce, YHVH, is used in the second. That's his covenantal name. So what's going on here? So my great uncle basically wrote, and you have to understand, my great uncle wrote this essay during the space race. So the extraordinary nature of technological development was being made manifest. Talking about a man who was born in the early 1900s. So he's seen more technological change than anyone would have seen in a lifetime in human history. Yeah. Because he goes from horse and buggy to flying on an airplane. So he says there's actually two different aspects of human nature that are being described here. And they're both part of us. They're both divinely willed. Genesis 1 describes human beings created in the image of God. What does that mean? That's our capacity to imitate God as creator, to be great, to be great. But, and here was his warning to America. He said, if that's all you have, right, then your life will be very unfulfilled, because there's the other element of us, which is that we are mortal. We are dust to dust. And the only way of dealing with that, truly, is through covenantal relationships. And covenantal relationships only come through sacrifice. That's why Adam has to give up part of himself to create Eve. And they're both part of us. And so we don't deny technological, the importance of technological development, but we also have to look for covenantal relationships. That's a modern example of what it means to study the Bible.
And you're engaging there in a highly symbolic reading of the text. Now, it's not denying for a second, but you say about the, the Mosaic authorship and so on.
There are different layers of interpretation.
Right, now you begin this process
there are different layers.
Call it symbolic, associative, allegorical in some cases.
And thereby it ends up speaking to every generation, to the challenges that it faces, right? In other words, everyone knows the statement Neil Armstrong made about human greatness. One small step for man, one giant step for mankind. Very few people know about the last man on the moon, Gene Cernan. And the last thing he did before leaving the moon, last time man was on the moon, is he wrote into the lunar dust, TDC, Tracy Dawn Cernan. That's his daughter's initials. And which means that when he's at this moment of immense human achievement, what he's thinking about is his connection to another human being. And to some extent, that tells us more about human beings than anything than Neil Armstrong's footprint does. So that's what it means to study the Bible as the Word of God and to see new insights in every generation. That's what it means to study the Torah.
Well, see, there's so many tensions there. I think, I don't repudiate the historical critical method, but its stated purpose was to uncover the intention of the human author of the text. But what that bracketed out on purpose as a methodological assumption is the divine authorship of the scripture, where someone like Thomas Aquinas will say, using instrumental causality, I mean, he certainly accepted that, but that God is the principal author of the scripture. Read Ratzinger's essay from 1988. It was a talk he gave in New York, actually, where he said, okay, to the historical critical method, but it can't be the whole way to look at the Bible, because it brackets out this dimension of, well, what is God saying to us in this text? And the classical tradition, certainly Christian tradition, knew that. But it got compromised a bit, I think, by a hyper stress on, the human authorship, the historical process, and so on.
To approach it as, for me, to approach it as a human text without divine inspiration in let's say the Psalms or divine prophecy, something like Isaiah, or divine dictation, as in the Mosaic Law. It's not just for us. It's not just a theological error. It means you will actually end up missing out on. You'll first say, well, this text says this text says this. What is it trying? Clearly, there were two authors. It will be the critic's response. And actually, no, even someone who studies literature, where is written by one author, knows, and that's with a human being, you will know that there is complexity to a work, to a great literary work. If you study a play by Shakespeare.
Or a James Joyce novel or something.
Whatever.
Right.
So it will actually blind you to the grandeur of this text.
So, that's how you'd respond, like to the Wellhausen proposal. Like, well, clearly we have, there's one author that uses Elohim all the time, the other uses Yahweh all the time, and so they're different authors.
And it's reached its final conclusion, Bishop, which is that now in secular society, they don't even see it as a great book. Right. People, the contemporary society doesn't. There was an episode of in July 2023. There's an episode of Jeopardy where, and you have to be
what was it again?
They literally say that the game show host reads the answer and says, this biblical book contains the verse, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. And all three contestants, you have to know something to get on Jeopardy.
Right.
Stare blankly at
No idea. Yeah, I know.
And so it's not just that it's no longer seen as the good book, the Bible. It's how can you be educated about literature if you don't know what the Bible meant to Shakespeare?
Lincoln.
Or Lincoln, of course.
Yeah.
Lincoln spoke It's like Adam Gopnik said about Lincoln, that Lincoln had so imbibed the King James Bible that he was able to speak in a way that made it sound as if it was the will of God that Ohio and Alabama should have the same post office system. And he did that because he knew that's how his countrymen thought and spoke.
The Father of waters flows once again unvexed to the sea.
Yeah, he
says after Vicksburg
He
fall.
began 7 years ago, not because he would say, it's 4 minutes to 8, right?
Right.
But because he wanted it to sound like the King James Bible. And so the end result of saying, it's a pastiche of this and of that and of this and of that, is actually, ironically, is that it becomes less than literature itself.
Yeah. How about, let me press another one. Like Martin Note has a hypothesis of the Deuteronomistic history, that from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, you have at least one editor who's supervised that whole thing. It's really one great narrative.
I mean,
plausible. How do you, let's say, of course, Deuteronomy is in the Torah.
For us, Deuteronomy is in the Torah.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
But after that, let's say, is it possible that there was an editor that told that whole story all the way through to 2 Kings?
Jewish tradition informs us that Joshua, right, gives us Joshua, right? I mean, the question is why?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ultimately, the question has to be, why are you making that case? Are you finding literary connections between all three?
Yeah,
let's talk about the significance of it.
Yeah.
But of course, if something is divinely inspired, that's also important. So, it's people say, there's a second Isaiah because he's talking about
a Trito Isaiah.
Events.
There's 3. Yeah.
There's why. So if you press it, well, he's talking about Cyrus. That's an event that happened hundreds of years after he existed. To which the traditional response is, you mean he's predicting an event that is yet to come because he's a prophet? Right? And of course, that happens. That happens in the Book of Kings too, right?
Yeah.
Jeroboam is on his pagan altar.
Yeah.
And a prophet shows up and says, many generations from now, there will be a king named Josiah who will uproot this. That's like their job, right? Prophets. And so often it's just based on the presumption.
Right, the naturalistic presumption that it couldn't possibly be a real prophecy.
My favorite of all, if I can, is Book of Kings describes one of the greatest miracles in Jewish history, which is the king of Assyria, emperor of Assyria, really, Sancherib, surrounds Hezekiah's Jerusalem. Okay, and we have to understand they have already gotten rid of 10 out of the 12 tribes. Which means that if this happened, this would be the end of Judaism. And we know that this happened, that they surrounded Jerusalem, not just from the Bible, because we have Assyria's depictions of their rampage through Judea, destruction of the city of Lachish. And Sancherib has in his own records, I have surrounded Hezekiah as a bird is trapped in his cage. Now, we also know that after that, in Assyrian records, nothing.
Yeah.
And that the Assyrian Empire disappears, soon after. So what happens? We have the Bible.
We have the account there.
Says, right, an angel goes out and strikes dead 185,000 troops, which leading to the English translation of the Hebrew, which I always found funny, which is, and it was when they woke up in the morning that they were dead. We've all been there. So you'll see historians will say, well, clearly something happened. So what is it? And the things that they will come up with. Herodotus tells us about mice in Egypt that affected the troops. As I put it, this is not a story of mice and men, right? This is this. So sometimes the Occam's razor is
the simplest explanation is
if you have a people story. Let's leave aside the question of who authored the Bible. Obviously, I have a strong belief as to who wrote the Mosaic Law and who wrote the Bible in general. It's at the heart of my tradition. But if we can let's leave it aside. Everyone can agree that at one point in history, some tiny people, right, claims that they were chosen by God to play a role in history unlike any other, and that through them, what they called the God of Abraham would be known. Be known to the world. They also said that they would be exiled, that exile was a real possibility or probability. They said that They said that because their covenant with God is eternal, they will never cease to exist even as other greater nations disappear, and that they will return. So, did this happen or didn't it? Okay, and so what is the Occam's razor explanation? And so all of these things, a lot of them, in my view, just begin with premises that deny the divine and providential action of the world, whereas actually this story is the greatest argument for providence.
Yeah, there's no question like the historical critical method has its roots in the rationalism and all that of the Enlightenment and so on. Do you know the story about Karl Barth, who didn't like natural theology, didn't like arguments for God's existence, but someone asked him, is there an argument for God's existence? And he said, yeah, the ongoing existence of the Jews.
Yeah, there are others who said that. I mean, in an interesting way, there was the Jewish theologian that I wrote my doctorate on, Michael Wishigrad, was very impacted by Karl Barth, called himself a Jewish Barthian.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he called himself a Jewish Barthian. So he met Karl Barth.
Yeah, all right.
And Barth thought that was very funny because he was so profoundly Christian. And so at one point he said to Michael, he said to him, and we're talking about a theologian that engaged Christian theologians in a very profound way. And they each impacted each
he's
other.
read widely among Christians.
Read widely among Christians, and he was very profoundly impacted by reading Christian theology. One point, Barth says to him, he says, you Jews have the promise, but we Christians have the fulfillment. And so Wishigrad said, he said, look, if God if a human being makes a promise, there's many reasons why the promise might not get fulfilled. Maybe he dies, or maybe he gets sick, or he runs out of money and he can't do it. He says, if God makes a promise, then it's like money in the bank. So if we have a promise, then we have to have a fulfillment. If we don't have a fulfillment, then we can't have had the promise. And there's a silence. This is in Switzerland, silence. And then Barth says, I never thought of it that way. And so the story of this people is a story of a people that has made some claims about itself. And I think some of their claims have been fulfilled in our time. Desert blooming in the Holy Land, Jerusalem expanding beyond its walls, things like that. And so it's just often the premises at the heart of some of these questions are questions that the presumptions of faith are the least likely. What if they're the most likely?
Right, and that I think certainly is true as a kind of hermeneutical supposition in that approach. Can I shift gears a little bit to philosophy, which was sort of, besides Haim Potok, was one of my great ways into religion. As a young guy, I discovered Thomas Aquinas, and it just kind of opened my mind and fascinated me. And I studied medieval philosophy and all that. Maimonides I would have heard of before the Big Lebowski from Aquinas, right? So he's in the Big Lebowski, right? The Rambam.
They call him the Rambam, which stands for Rabbi Moses ben Maimon.
Ben Maimon.
And that's what we call him. We call him the Rambam.
Well, and speaking of calling him something, to me it's very intriguing that Aquinas always speaks very respectfyou
Moses.
Rabbi Moses. Rabbi Moises, he always calls him. Which I think is kind of marvelous. How do you, or Rabbi Moses, how do you read the Exodus 3:14, the I am who I am? Because it's at the source of what I think is the most fundamental thing we can say about God. Thomas expresses in terms of God's simplicity.
Right.
To be God is to be to be. God is not a particular type of being. God's not in the genus of being. To be God is to be to be. And then in God, all things come to be and participate and so on. The whole Christian metaphysics, which I think fell apart at the beginning of modernity, which is the source of a lot of mischief in my judgment. But the source of all of that is Exodus 3:14, and Thomas will use Aristotelian language to express it, or things borrowed from the Arabs and so on. But the fountainhead is that text. How did you? Let's say as a young kid, you're reading the text with your partner. How did you read?
So as
what is it? How do you read that?
So as a child, I probably would have had no idea, quite honestly.
But how do you read it now?
That's like, C.S. Lewis' story of that the child was once taught that about God's omnipresence, right? That he's just a simple substance or something like that. And he said that this child envisioned God as a tapioca pudding. He said, which was most unfortunate because this child disliked tapioca. Right? So as a child, I had no idea.
How do you read it now?
Since studying theology and philosophy, I've actually, Michael Wishigrad was known as a non-Maimonidean, actually.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, And I myself am not, I study Maimonides, and we study Maimonides' legal writings very intensively.
Yeah, okay.
First, in philosophy, while he is one of the greatest and most influential Jewish philosophers of all time, I'm not a Maimonidean.
Who's your favorite Jewish philosopher?
His great medieval counterpart, Judah Halevi, is his name, who wrote a Plato-style dialogue between a rabbi and the king of the Khazars, called the Kuzari. And he was born in the same place, he wasn't born, he lived in the same place in Spain that Maimonides was born the next generation. And the way I describe to my students is that, to use the parlance of our times. It sounds
That's the big Lebowski.
To read Halevi is that you think you're reading subtweets of Maimonides, because it's about the limits of philosophy and reason as much as, and even though it's being written before Maimonides, but he knew the spirit of the time in which he was. So Maimonides is very interested in divine simplicity, as is Aquinas. But, and here Aquinas has, I think, a very good critique of Maimonides, actually. That leads Maimonides to ask the question, well, what does it mean to speak about God's knowledge, or God's love, or God's, right? What is it, how does you, Bishop, your knowledge is separate from yourself, right? So Maimonides, they're all very bothered by these questions. What does it mean to attribute something to the divine?
Well, the equivocity of problem.
Right. What does it mean to speak of divine love? What does it mean to speak of divine anger?
Is it utterly different than when we use the word love?
So Maimonides says it's utterly different, right? Aquinas says that's
and Aquinas disagrees with
that. And he says he uses the word analogical.
Right.
And
if Scotus is like univocal predication. Right. That's how we always read Maimonides, was he's the other extreme.
But that is not the way most Jews approach this. In other words, we begin the Shema every day with the blessing, "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who loves his people Israel." So what does that mean? So Maimonides will say, in that case, well, God can't have emotion in the usual sense, right? So it means, it's what he calls an attribute of action, right? He acts toward us as one would act toward somebody he loved. I don't believe that. I mean, I believe God actually loves us.
And so would Aquinas, obviously. So
and what that means is that, and here it's close to what Aquinas means by analogical. In other words, so when God says he loves us the way a father loves his children, or the way a spouse loves his bride, right? It doesn't mean that there's hormones there, for example.
Right.
But the love is genuine.
It's willing the good of the other. So something like that. So our love is...
See, here's what I say. And here's where I say I'm actually kind of a Thomist.
Yeah.
It's not just willing the good of the other. What I mean by that is, you're describing, if I can speak in the terms of Christian theology for a minute? That's what happens in Word on Fire stays in Word on Fire. Right? You're describing what agape is.
Yeah.
Right? But Aquinas actually argues that love in general is not just purely generous, right? Imagine you're doing a wedding, Bishop, or I'm doing a wedding, and we say you say to the bride about the husband, and he loves you so much, he just wants what's good for you. He's not interested in getting anything out of this. He's not self-interested in this relationship. He gets nothing out of this relationship. Mazel tov, right? That would be like the worst wedding speech ever, right? Because in a genuine covenantal relationship, each person gets something out of that relationship and gives, right?
Well, they're two creatures, though. That's a creature-to-creature relationship.
So let's talk about God.
If God can't be in a dependent relationship to a creature.
So I think, and this is what Wishgrad argues.
Yeah, go ahead.
God, of course, doesn't need to be in
right.
But when he chooses to be.
Yeah, and that's different, yeah.
But then he's putting himself in a state of vulnerability.
So to speak.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Well, so to speak. But what that means is God describes Israel, God is angry.
Yeah.
So let me put it to you. When it says that God loves Israel, is that different than what it means he's angry at Israel? Or they're both doing the same?
An expression of the love.
Oh, okay.
Love is what God is, I would say. I was a Christian.
That means he's reacting as someone who's hurt.
Not reacting, but it's a passion to set things right.
Well, is he not reacting?
He can't react in a creaturely way. Otherwise, then he becomes one creature among many.
But he does react, right? Meaning it is in response.
It's analogical predication we'd have to use.
It's in response to what. So I think when it says God loves us, God gets angry at us, though his anger at Israel is not enduring, right? I think that does mean something like what we mean.
Yeah, something like it.
So
right,
but that does mean.
But we have to strip it of any kind of creaturely quality that would render God a creature, render God dependent upon his creation.
Right, but
that can't be right.
I agree with that, except I would ask you, what are we assuming is human rather than divine? In other words, why do you? Well, I'm not saying you are saying this, but people often think to say, oh, somebody to be angry or hurt, whatever that means, is a human quality. Why? Why can't we have that because we are created in God's image?
Whatever is beautiful and loving about it would be true of God, but whatever is purely creaturely about it can't be true of God. Otherwise, we compromise, I would say, exactly what's in Exodus 3:14. That's why I want to go back to that.
Let's bring us to Exodus 3:14.
Yeah, so how do you now, Rabbi Soloveichik, at the age of whatever you are now, how do you
Maimonides reads that? Maimonides reads that as just an argument for the existence of God. That he really believes, he writes this in his Guide for the Perplexed, that Moses went and presented kind of like the ontological argument. The existence of God. That's not, I don't think, what's happening in the Hebrew Bible.
What is happening? How do you read it?
Okay. So the phrase "I will be," right? It's not "I am that I am," even though in the video footage we have of that moment from the Ten Commandments,
from Charlton Heston,
right? Charlton Heston, right, says "I am that I am," which is a Maimonidean way of reading it. I am pure. I am necessary existence. I am the only. All other existence is contingent, and I am necessary.
Right.
That's not what this means, I don't think. What it means is, I will be with this people, which means is, I am the God that makes himself known first and foremost through the story of my covenant people. The rabbis comment, where is God when he's saying this? How is he appearing to Abraham? He is appearing out of
the burning bush.
What kind of bush?
Burning.
Thorn bush. A sneh in Hebrew is a thorn bush. It's a burning thorn bush.
Is that the menorah connection?
No, that's an interesting thing. I could talk about that. But he says, so the rabbis say, God is speaking to Israel out of a thorn bush, as if to say, I am, this is a Hebrew phrase, of course, goes back, way back. I am with them in distress. Okay? And which means that to some extent, God is pained when his people are in pain. What does that mean?
But there's tons of Christian theologians, like when I was coming of age, that follow that line, that tried to get away from the kind of very ontological language into much more of that kind of relational but you know, it's always puzzled me a bit. So the translators of Septuagint render that ego eimi haon. Now, I imagine those people knew Hebrew really well and knew Greek really well, and they chose I am the one who is. Right, to render that phrase.
Absolutely, and I think that is a Greek-influenced reading.
Yeah, but I'm always trying to defend in some ways the ontological because it's so basic in our tradition. And in more recent years, we've done that line that you've been pursuing, which I really have no trouble with because I think that's an implication of I am who I am. I think that's an implication of God's nature.
Right. I guess it comes to the question. Really, this gets the most fundamental question of what is the source of your faith, and how do you know God exists? Right. So if you open Maimonides. Right? Maimonides believes that the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, is actually a commandment to know God exists. Right? And he actually says that he believes you can know it from Aristotle's proof of the unmoved moon.
Right, yeah.
Right? But if you look at the writing of the thinker I mentioned, Judah Halevi, who wrote this right before Maimonides. So the idea is that there's a king of Khazars and he has a symposium of religions. So he brings in a rabbi and he says, who do you believe in? He says, I believe in the God who took Israel out of Egypt. And he says to him, well, that's a pretty silly way to begin. He says, you should have begun with, I believe in the God who created the universe. And he responds and he says that He says, well, God doesn't introduce himself that way. God is, of course, the creator of the universe.
Right, yeah.
And of course it's true that only he is the necessary. Only his existence is necessary.
Yeah.
And all other existence is contingent.
Right.
But he wants to be known first and foremost as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
I find that fascinating because it's the order of knowing, order of being thing.
Yeah.
You know, yes, in the order of being, there's this sort of ontological primacy to God's non-contingent nature.
Right.
But see, and here's my version of it. When I was a high school kid, Fenwick High School, right, being taught by Dominicans, I'm born and raised Catholic, going to Mass every Sunday and all that. And when I first hear Aquinas' argument for a prime mover, it really excited me. But here's what I find really interesting in retrospect, is I said, yeah, that's God. In other words, I knew God already. You know what I'm saying? I wouldn't have recognized that proof as indicating God unless...
That's just so interesting.
See, I learned
that's
God
what
from the
Kierkegaard
Mass.
asked about Anselm, right? In other words,
yeah, right.
Anselm prayed.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Of course.
And, to show me this proof.
Yes.
And Kierkegaard said, does the beloved pray for a proof of the existence of the beloved when he's in the embrace of the beloved?
Anselm tells us why, because his brothers asked him, can you help us? And so he, of course, he doesn't use the argument to convince himself that God exists.
Right.
What it's like to be in the presence of the unconditioned reality, and then he articulates it in that way.
Right.
So I think that's really right. I like that.
And I value the philosophical approach very much. I teach it.
Yeah.
Right? All I'm saying is that God in the burning bush, when Moses is saying to him, who shall I say is sending to me? I don't believe that God is sending to hundreds of thousands of persecuted slaves a philosophical statement about his necessary existence.
Yeah.
He is sending them a sustaining message. I am with you. And I am about to make my presence known.
But isn't his covenant fidelity also, it's not a functional, but it's correlative to his nature. You know, that if God is fickle and God comes and goes and he's like a creature, so now I'm friendly, now I'm not. Now I'm with you, now I'm not. It's precisely his ontological stability, if you want, that grounds his covenantal fidelity.
So in the Bible, by and large, it is true, right? Samuel will say to Saul, right, something like that, the eternal of Israel will not lie, things like that.
Yeah.
And that seems to make a metaphysical statement, right? And Isaiah will be filled with statements about how different God is.
See, and that's very important to me, that section, we'd say in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, but when the incomparability of God.
But
because if he's just one God among many.
Hand in hand with that is that his promises to Israel will be fulfilled. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so what I'm saying is that
if he's one little God among many, then I can't trust him.
Metaphysically, everything you're saying is absolutely is correct. Yeah. It's just that God doesn't speak about himself that way. In other words, it's interesting. It's by and large, God. Scripture doesn't ask the same questions that Plato asked or Aristotle asked.
But
that doesn't mean there isn't great wisdom to study.
And that you can you can explicitate what's implicit there. Like, I do think that section, I wonder if you agree, that section of Isaiah, to me, is of supreme theological importance. When, how many times does God say, there's no one like me. I'm not like them. I'm incomparable.
But what's the context in which he's saying that? You're right, of course. But why is he saying that? I know, of course, because we say...
Bringing the exiles back.
Exactly. Yeah. In other words, he's saying, so it's less a focus, even there, is less a focus on metaphysics and more a focus on God's providence being made manifest in history.
Yeah. No, and they're just, to me, they're just correlative.
They are correlative. The question is, what is to me, it's an interesting, important question. What is the primary source of faith, right? And for me, it's impossible, just to speak personally, because obviously no one's here, right? For me to speak personally, it's impossible, right? This statement, I think that's from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, that what it means, I will be, is that I'm the God who is made known through Jewish history. But for me, if you ask me, what is the root of my faith? I see the story of my people, and I cannot believe that this is not providential.
To me, it's very interesting, this conversation, because I think that's true. My faith came from my parents teaching me the faith, and from the Mass. The Mass is extremely biblical from beginning to end. And then the readings from the Bible I would have heard at Mass, the preaching I would have heard, that's what shaped my faith. And I would say the Holy Spirit. At a certain point in my life, the philosophical was like a kind of a light bulb going off. It was like an explicitation that allowed me to say, yeah, that all really coheres. But I think that's right. I would say the Holy Spirit. I want to follow up something else too, because you said like, who's God? The one who, liberated his people Israel. There's a whole strain of Christian theology that would say something like, well, who's God? The one that raised Jesus from the dead. That's the God I'm talking about, And to prescind in a way from like very abstract philosophical, because Christians would see that as the fulfillment of Israel, as the trajectory of the great narrative of Israel, as the God who raised Jesus from the dead. So I like that approach. I like the narrative, the biblical, the Holy Spirit centered. But then in correlation to what can be philosophically articulated, it's kind of the way I would, think it through.
As I said, I teach philosophy, right? And I teach a central part of what my center at Yeshiva University does is teach Judaic texts and philosophical texts side by side. We have a course called Athens and Jerusalem, where we are reading Greek texts and rabbinic texts side by side.
Give me an example. I'm intrigued by that. An example of like a philosophical text you read that you find really illuminating vis-a-vis the Bible.
So you sometimes you read them as through illumination and sometimes through total contrast.
Yeah, right.
And it could be side by side with the Bible, or it'll be side by side with rabbinic texts. So one example I will give.
Give me an example. Yeah.
If you read Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics.
Yeah. Love those texts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we love them. I was about to say, what's Jewish about them? What's biblical about them? And what's not? So Maimonides, actually, in his code, incorporates Nicomachean Ethics in a profound way.
As Aquinas does too. In
Absolutely.
His moral theology.
Absolutely. And on the one hand, Aristotle will enrich our reading of our study of faith, because what Nicomachean Ethics will provoke us to ask is not just what should we do or not do, right? But what type of person are we?
Yeah.
And who are we meant to be? Who is God calling us? What is the teleology of the human being?
Right.
So, and that's so much in the Bible is rules, right? But of course the Bible has a vision of who we are and who we are meant to be. And reading Nicomachean Ethics will inspire that. At the same time, if you read both the Politics and Nicomachean Ethics, here's what you'll see. Greek thought doesn't have it all, really, classical thought. And the Bible gave to the world the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God and therefore equal.
Yeah, right.
There is, as my teacher, Rabbi George, great Catholic thinker, said, nothing in Aristotle.
No, the contrary.
Aristotle has inequality.
The contrary, right. Justice is predicated upon inequality.
And to go back to my Moses comment, humility, as Leon Kass points out,
it's not a Greek virtue. Yeah,
it's Leon Kass. Do you know that?
Sure,
Leon Kass, the great Jewish thinker, who spent so much time at the University of Chicago teaching classical thought, and then started teaching the Bible.
Then got the Bible.
So he was asked, and he said, if he was asked about what are the profound differences, he says, first and foremost, he says one of the central elements is, right? Aristotle says of the great-souled man, he wonders at nothing, for all is great to him, for all is small to him. Humility is not a virtue.
He strides the world like a colossus.
Yes, humility is not a virtue.
Right.
Second, the notion of equality.
Yeah, it's not there in the Greeks.
Third, the notion of vocation, that God has a calling for you specifically.
Yeah.
That is unique to you. The unmoved mover doesn't have any vocations for you. And so on the one hand, the Nicomachean Ethics is a work that can truly provoke you to think about what it means to be a creature created by God with a teleology, with a purpose.
Yeah.
But there are also elements that are so foreign, and that's part of what I want students to see. What did we, meaning the Jews, what did we give to civilization? What did we give?
We wouldn't have the American setup at all without the biblical.
Exactly.
There's no way. And I've argued that for years, that we think, equality. Of course everyone believes that. No, they don't. And in classical thought, on the contrary.
No, it's taken for granted.
On the contrary. And so you get rid of religion. You will get rid of equality in very short order. Human rights, Aristotle writes maybe for an elite, or Plato for the highest members. But everyone's got human rights.
Even Thomas Jefferson right? Not the most devout of the fathers.
But endowed by their creator.
Endowed by the creator and inscribed on the Jefferson Memorial in one of his moments of brutal honesty when he's reflecting on slavery.
Yeah, that's right.
And he says, God who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed their sole foundation that these liberties are the gift of God?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And that's biblical stuff.
And so we read this side by side, and we read rabbinic texts with Marcus Aurelius side by side. We do all sorts of things like that.
No, but that's very instructive to me because I think it's very close to what Aquinas does with Aristotle, whom he reverences.
Yes.
But Thomas is not just a medieval Aristotle commentator.
No
way. He's, some of the great texts of Aquinas that no one reads anymore. He has this marvelous commentary on Job, long, detailed commentary on Job, long commentary on Isaiah. He was immersed in the Old Testament.
Yes.
And that's what really shaped his mentality.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why he was so interestingly open to reading Maimonides.
Yeah.
Who, as you noted, he quotes with great respect.
Yeah, always.
But it reflects, I wrote a book on the history of Jewish leaders.
Yeah, which I like very much.
And one of the things I noted is that the model of biblical leadership is that it incorporates both great independent action, as any leader must embody, with humility, with the notion that you are nothing compared to God.
Yeah.
Or as I put it, the great leader needs to play three-dimensional chess while at the same time believe that he or she is a pawn in God's heavenly hand.
Yeah.
And that's David, of course, if you read the Psalms. That's the grandeur of the Psalms. But throughout history, we've had very few of that. We've had very little. Churchill is one of my heroes. But, no one would say that humility was
one of his great...
As my friend Andrew Roberts, the historian, said, Churchill believed in God, but in his theology, God's job was largely taking care of Winston Churchill. But Lincoln has this, right? So to bring us back to the story of Judaism in America, one of the great reflections of biblical culture in America is that Lincoln will, on the one hand, be the boldest leader America has ever had.
And the
Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
And at the same time, say at certain points, in describing the Emancipation Proclamation, in describing what he did, he writes, I cannot say that I controlled events, but rather that events controlled me. And so what I ask students to do is to read these texts side by side and to gain, to draw its wisdom from Plato and Aristotle, but also to say, what is intention with our approach? Why is it that at a symposium, it's all the esteemed men of Athens, whereas our Passover Seder will be focused on children? Right? What is the biblical philosophy of the family that is entirely different from, let's say, Plato's world? Why does Jacob seek to be surrounded by his children as he dies? Whereas Socrates in the Phaedo will say to his wife and child, basically, get out of here. I want to hang out with my philosophical homies. Right? Yeah. What does that tell about the hero of the classical works versus the heroes of the Bible? And that's part of what I ask students in a Socratic way, ironically, to answer.
Hey, can I ask you, we're coming to the end of our time. I could talk to you all day. I mean, a bit of a provocative question, but, I'm a Catholic bishop, you're a Jewish rabbi.
Sounds like the beginning of a joke.
It's the beginning of a joke, yeah. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Rome speaking to young kids, this jubilee of young people, and we're at St. Paul outside the walls, right, one of the great basilicas of Rome. And I was at this podium, and about 20 yards behind me is the tomb of St. Paul, right? We say St. Paul, right? Rabbi Shaul of Tarsus. And I was thinking a lot about Paul, Paul who says, look, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israelite, I'm the tribe of Benjamin, I was circumcised on the 8th day.
Studied at the feet of Gamaliel.
I'm a Pharisee by training, right? So he's like, I am all the way, I'm all in. Romans 9-11, the reaffirmation of the covenant and the reaffirmation of his Judaism. It seems to me that what happened to him is he's persecuting the faith because how can a crucified carpenter be the Messiah of Israel? Give me a break. He's killed with the hands of Israel's enemies. That's like the clearest proof possible. This is not the Messiah of Israel. So he's persecuting the church. And then something happened to him, right? And now we have an account of that. We follow Paul's own account. you read his letters, no way this is some raving lunatic or someone who's living in delusional space. I mean, I say it maybe it's a provocative question, but how do you make sense of someone like him? How do you make sense of someone like Paul? As you read Romans or you read Galatians or you read these texts, where it's clearly, as I look at you, I think, well, someone like you, with a formation similar, knew all the texts we've been talking about.
I've not been to Damascus, by the way.
No, but
now you never know. I may end up going. Yeah.
Just how do you make sense of someone like Paul?
So I actually have a chapter on Paul in my dissertation.
Go ahead.
But it's not that anyone has ever read my dissertation. It's
no, but share that with us.
But Paul has a certain insight. Now, of course, a lot of the theological premises of these insights, to a great extent, will be things that I disagree with, of course, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But Paul's writing about the law, right? What Paul understands is that the commandments I observe, right, are signs of God's covenantal relationship with the Jewish people, and the unique nature of that covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So when Paul is writing to the Galatians,
yeah.
there's a wonderful book. This would be a cool interview if I can recommend.
Yeah.
There's a book called Strangers and Neighbors. I don't know if you know this book.
Mm-hmm.
It's written by Maria Pogge Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
So Maria's
the Abraham thing, Strangers and Neighbors.
It's called Strangers and Neighbors, and it's building on. I don't know if it's building on the Abraham line, but I am a stranger and a neighbor among you.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is a Catholic professor of systematic theology in Scranton, and she was the way she becomes friends with. She becomes friends with. I don't want to say the Orthodox Jews of her neighbor, because there's no Orthodox Jewish neighbor in Scranton, but Orthodox Jewish neighbors on her block.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book called Strangers and Neighbors, What I've Learned About Christianity by Living Among Orthodox Jews. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah, I'd like to read that.
Beautiful book. And I wrote a review of it.
Okay.
I wrote a review of it. And she sits in on a lot of the holiday observances. And then she says, at one point, in a very honest moment, she says that she feels like she wants to sort of do these rituals.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says something like that she hears Paul say, "Foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Right? Now, what she means by that is, as I understand it, is that Paul understands, because I do a lot of rituals every day.
Yeah.
And to people outside of Judaism, some of them might seem really weird.
Yeah.
Okay, but actually, almost all of them are linked in some way to the covenantal relationship that God has with the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if I'm keeping kosher, right, it's exactly what if the Peter eating non-kosher in the Book of Acts is all about, really, right? Which is about the keeping kosher. We choose as we eat as a constant reminder of God's chosenness.
Yeah, yeah.
If I put on phylacteries, we are binding ourselves to God.
Yeah.
We're binding ourselves to God every day, physically. And so Paul understood that the law has to be understood within that context. Now, of course, that then leads to his own view about what the future of the law should be.
Yeah, right.
And that's the part with which I would disagree. In other words, the part where, that's not the only thing on which I would disagree with Paul, but in other words, where Paul seems to go theologically is the notion that the law cannot be a means of earning good standing in the presence of God. And for Jews, right, the distinction between law and love does not exist.
Yeah.
For us, the law is an expression of God's love. As Archbishop Chaput said, he comes into the study hall and he sees Jews studying abstract Talmudic legal texts, and he literally feels the love.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, I get that.
Because for us, the two are the same.
Yeah.
every thou shalt is an expression of God's faith in us. That doesn't mean, spoiler alert if you read the Bible, that the Jews always do a great job of keeping the commandments.
Right.
They fail from time to time, every other chapter,
Yeah.
right? So, but Paul understands that when he writes, says, oh, you're a non-Jew that wants to keep the Torah, here's what you're missing about this, right? If you believe in a faith that's not now linked to a people specifically, then it doesn't make sense to keep the Torah. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In other words, that's what I think Paul, what he believed about the future of the actual people of Israel, I mean, that's of course.
Something Rabbi Sachs said, you mentioned him earlier, somebody really reverenced, and he said, the great role that Christianity's played vis-a-vis Judaism is it brought the God of Israel to the world. It brought the Torah to the world. And I think that's how someone like Paul would have read those texts in Isaiah about, all the tribes coming. And he saw in the resurrected Jesus the fulfillment of Israel. And so now it's time to bring all the nations to Jerusalem, so to speak. Now, not literally for him, but...
So the question is, what did he think would literally happen to Israel? The actual physical Israel. I know what I believe, obviously.
Yeah.
And I know what a lot of, and my views are, in other words, I know what I believe about Isaiah, right? I think the question, and this is the great, I think, and it relates theologically to central events of our time. In other words, so if Isaiah says that the roads to Jerusalem will be so populated that they will be crowded, and Jews were reading that at a time when it seemed ludicrous, right? If Zechariah says that that elders and children will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, so then, and Isaiah says, this is my bar mitzvah passage I read on my bar mitzvah, that God has consoled Zion, for he has made its desert into an Eden, and its wilderness into a garden of God. So what do you do when those things actually happen, right? Like, meaning you can go to the desert right now in the Holy Land, and there's gardens growing, there are crops growing. You can go to Jerusalem, which until 100 years ago, outside its walls was desolate. And now there are Israeli cab drivers, cursing the traffic, right, that it takes to get into. Right? And so, and I make it a principle, and this is a principle of my great uncle, not to tell people of other faiths what to believe. Like, I don't have a public meaning in a public discussion. I'm not going to come and say, here's what you should think, or what do we have in, like, let's try to find the what's in common here. That's but as I study the history of religion, and which is what I guess what I do, and then just world events, right? So the question then becomes, how are you going to read in Isaiah when a lot of these events have physically occurred? Of course, as a person throughout history and faith throughout history have approached Scripture in a variety of different ways.
He would have said in Christ. I'm sure Paul would have said in Christ, Israel's fulfilled.
Well, of course, Paul would have believed that. Of course, Paul would have believed that. And
then would have read that language more symbolically.
But only symbolically? In other words, that's meaning.
Yeah.
This is, I know what a lot of American Christians think, which is that this is not just a sign of providence, but maybe the greatest sign in our time. Because how often does it happen that a prophecy could be written 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, and it's literally happening? Yeah. I have sat with my father and mother and my children in the streets of Jerusalem. And that was being quoted by Jews when Hadrian plowed Jerusalem under and made it into Aelia Capitolina. Capitolina, and the notion that Jews could ever return to Jerusalem was
pretty unlikely at the time.
Right, and I would say, just again to speak personally, that the Christians that I know that do believe, because I'm not speaking theologically, I'm just speaking personally, the Christians that that do believe that they see in what unfolds in the Holy Land as a fulfillment of God's word.
Yeah.
They have been a great blessing to the Jewish people. And it's incumbent upon Jews to show gratitude for the way they have, for the way many of those Christians, especially right now, have stood by the Jewish people in a very difficult time. So I think it's a very complicated question
It is.
about what Paul believed.
Yeah.
But just stepping outside theologically more as a historian, speaking sort of from a historical perspective of religion and what are the issues of this time, world events are always, how can we not interpret, if faith is everything to us, so we have to try as best we can to see what happens in the world from a religious perspective.
I think
we can get it wrong.
His evangelization as the culmination. So he's proclaiming good news of the resurrection, and that's meant as a message first to Jews. That's why I went to synagogues first, because Jews will understand what we're talking about here, that covenant, Torah, temple, prophecy have reached their fulfillment. And Paul wants to tell first Jews about it, and then he wants Israel to realize its identity and drawing now the whole world to that fulfillment. That's probably how he saw it. Now, how that relates to, the present day state of Israel and so on is a question we'll have to do in part 2. We're opening up
that's the
wonderful complexity. You know what? I kept thinking all during our kids, I've gone over time with you because I've loved talking to you. This reminded me what you said with the people arguing over the Talmud. You know? So we've had a great chance to exchange ideas.
Absolutely. The story I always tell, I'll finish with this, is that Rabbi Israel Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, tells a story that he was visiting a soldier in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. And this soldier that had clearly come from a very secular Israeli background. Yeah. And came out of his coma, and the first thing he wanted to do was put on the phylacteries that we put on. Yeah. We pray with our phylacteries. That's what I did this morning before I came down. Didn't go to synagogue today because not a lot of ready available services necessarily in Rochester, but but first thing I did. And so he said, well, you're not from a religious background. So he says, I was fighting in the Sinai desert, and it was right after Yom Kippur, right after the war broke out. So it's the feast of Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, where we all sit in huts, right?
Booths,
booths, right?
Yeah.
So a Hasidic group drives up with a booth on the truck, and they're like, come in. They're sitting in their Jeep, and they say, come in here and say a blessing in the booth. And they said, no, we don't even do that. Not during war. It's war. We're not going to do this biblical, archaic stuff. I don't believe in any of this stuff. And they prevail on that. They get out of their Jeep. They go into the booth, and as they're in there, they hear an explosion. And they look out of the booth, and they see their Jeep has been hit by a missile, and it's a smoldering heap of junk. Yeah. So this secular Israeli looks at the Hasidic rabbi and says, I suppose you would call that a miracle. And he looks at him and says, what would you call it? Yeah. And so that's kind of my approach to world events sometimes. Yeah, I get it. And it may sound simple, but I think sometimes those are the questions that God is asking us to
Is there a line from the Coen brothers you could end with? What's something that would be, or something from the Big Lebowski?
Well, I do. I will tell you, I do own a T-shirt that was gifted to me that says "I don't roll on Shabbos."
Yeah, good.
And so it's the great line of Walter Sobchak, but without with some of the language.
Right. As I shared before we sat down formally, there is this great Christian reading of the Big Lebowski. I'd love to have.
That was the first thing I heard.
Sure.
First time I heard.
The dude as a Christ figure. But we should just have a session on that. Let's talk about the Coen Brothers movies.
I think we can make it happen because to quote Walter Sobchak quoting Theodore Herzl, "If you will a dude, it is no dream."
We'll put the text of the Coen Brothers and we can debate it. Rabbi, you're great. It was a delight to be with you.
It was a joy to be with you, Bishop. Thank you so much for having me.
God bless you.